We need to do a better job of teaching what the caregiver is. And I think caregiver is a newer word that we're starting to hear. It wasn't there at all when I first started caring. But we have to understand how integral and important the caregiver is. We have to understand what the caregiver is going through. And we have to understand that without the caregiver, the patient would suffer.
Hi, I'm Cian Xiao.
And I'm Sammy Winemaker. We talk about ways to put the human back at the center of care.
The Waiting Room Revolution starts right now. All right, welcome back to the Waiting Room Revolution. Today, we're thrilled to welcome a guest whose work sits at the heart of what we do on this podcast in our social movement, empowering caregivers to navigate serious illnesses with compassion and confidence. So, Stephanie Muskat is joining us. She is a registered social worker, therapist, and founder of Compassion in Caregiving, which is a practice that supports family caregivers through coaching and education. And we're going to get to talk to her about what that is all about and how she supports caregivers who face complex emotional and relational challenges in their journey. So, welcome to the podcast, Stephanie.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
I was lucky enough to be on Stephanie's podcast a while ago. So it's wonderful to reciprocate and hear and pick your brain this time.
Yeah, and it was a really, really well-liked episode. People really enjoyed it. So I'm glad I can be back to
Yeah.
to do this on your end.
Yeah, I mean, it would be great maybe if we can start with your own personal experiences with caregiving. I think
Yeah.
you've talked about of your mother and
Yeah.
grandmother. I
Yes.
mean, what you're willing to share, but
Yeah.
and then obviously how that's going to link to compassion in caregiving. But maybe just going back to that point when you weren't a caregiver and you got thrown into that role. What was that like?
Yeah, I'll give the Coles Notes version because it was a long journey and experience. But yeah, when I was 19, my mom was diagnosed with frontotemporal dementia, which is a more rare form of a dementia. And as a young only child, that was very confusing for me. I was in school trying to figure out my own life as a student and a person, I think. And then that was thrown on me. So I very quickly saw the gaps in our system in terms of what was available for mental health supports as me as a young caregiver. But I also saw that navigating the system was quite difficult early on. I thought it was because I was young. I thought that I just was uneducated and uninformed, and that, it's because I was this little person and people just didn't see me the same way as an adult. Unfortunately, as it continued, I saw that wasn't the case. I later was caring for my grandmother when I was 23, concurrently with my mom for a bit until my grandma passed away. And I started to see that maybe it was more than just that. It wasn't about me being a young person. And then fast forward, I became a social worker and worked inpatient for almost 10 years in hospital. And I realized that this was an everybody's experience and not a me experience. And so the gaps were very highlighted in many different ways, whether it was mental health supports and concerns, people navigating the system, not knowing where to go, not knowing where to seek help, and just an unawareness of the family system as a whole was pretty obvious as I was working in it. And I also saw a change in progression is in the system from the time I started to the time I left and began my company, Compassion and Caregiving. And I started my company because of the gaps that I continued to see and people saying, where do I get this support when I leave the hospital? And I said, yeah, I don't know. So I should probably start something. So that's what I did. And that was in 2021. And then I left the hospital in 2023. And I've been doing this full time. So that's
Wow.
essentially, I think I added a bit more about my work. But yeah, that was my caregiving journey, seeing the gaps, and now where I am today.
I want to hear more about what your business is like when you decided to leave the hospital.
Mhm.
What is it that you do?
Yeah, so it started out with me providing therapy, psychotherapy to caregivers specifically. So anything that they were dealing with from a mental health perspective throughout the journey, whether it was navigating systems, the actual caregiving, relational issues, figuring out diagnoses, etc. And then we also looked at grief throughout the entire process and then end of life and even after end of life. But I soon realized that wasn't enough and we needed to do more. So it has evolved over time into something that has become a podcast where we bring people on to talk about caregiving issues. It has become a lot of public speaking, workshops, webinars, and advocacy, and a lot of partnerships and collaborations across the board so we can actually work on changing the system as a whole. So, at its core, it is therapy. It's myself and four therapists right now in Ontario and Alberta, but it is much more than that at this point.
Mm-hmm. I
And
would think that all of that experience would have set you up when things started changing with your mom's condition to be
Mhm.
in a perfect position for things to go smoothly. So at some point, I know we're going to ask you more about that if you're
Yes.
to talk
Yeah,
about it.
I'm happy to talk about that. Yeah.
Yeah, but maybe Cian, were you going to ask another question first?
no, I think I was gonna try to understand that more, like unpeel that a bit. Like, what were some of the emotional and logistical challenges that you encountered when caring for your mom or your grandma, or and then when they were together? My goodness, at the same time,
Oh
like,
man. Yeah, I think early on, if we're talking about that time, it was I didn't know what was going on. So how do we get a diagnosis to begin with?
mm,
Where do we go? Who am I talking to? And then the wait times, not hearing back, having to follow up, finally getting some sort of answers and then having to figure out when we're scheduling again, not knowing what to do between appointments. That was a really, really hard one because her diagnosis was behavioral in nature and it was very, very taxing on myself and my father. And so that was really hard to navigate, not being able to reach the doctor. And my grandma, fortunately, but unfortunately, was a lot more straightforward. She had an obstruction one day, went to the hospital. They told us she had an obstruction. You can either get surgery or not. We decided no surgery, and that was that. So hers was much more straightforward. It was a few months versus, what was 16 years with my mom.
mm,
And concurrently was very hard because obviously it was my mom's mom. So my mom couldn't be
mm,
there to take care of her mom or make decisions. So I was making all the decisions. And I was also in school. I was finishing my master's degree at the time. And so just trying to figure out, and there was a lot of loss involved, right? Oh my gosh, why am I the granddaughter who is sitting here at my grandma's bedside? Although I loved her and I was very close to her, it felt very disjointed for me and it didn't
mm,
follow the pathway that I knew my friends to be following at the time. So it was very strange. No one I knew had been going through it. And I think everyone was really surprised when they saw me walk in the door, like, where's your mom? Or where's your dad? Or where's your this? And there was no mom, dad, or this. It was me.
mm,
So there was so much going on earlier. And then as you alluded to, Sammy, it was kind of crazy towards the recent months when she was passing away.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I just took a big breath because I remember you and I were in contact,
Hmm.
um, in the last chapters, let's say, of your mom's life.
Yeah.
As you said, her illness course was a 16-year story.
Yes.
And during that time, you're married, you have children, little children, and life goes on. You start your business. Uh,
Hmm.
then there's your dad and taking care of your dad as well, because
Yeah, kind of.
you
More
know,
so navigating my mom and helping him navigate my mom from the
yeah,
side. Yeah,
yeah.
he's pretty healthy, thank goodness, but he's okay.
So, where do you want to jump in, and what do you want listeners to know about the journey you had with your mom?
I think. what's important to talk about is what you said before, that you'd think that as someone who's worked in the system, I've worked with many people who were dying, who had declining illness across the board. And I still was not at all prepared for what we would face. And that just because I work in it and I know it does not mean that it's easy for me. You'd think it would be, but it wasn't. And you knew that well, Sammy, because we were talking a lot during that time. It was a struggle at a time that should not have been a struggle. And it was frankly awful to see a system that wasn't equipped to deal with compassion and to deal with support and to deal with a family alongside a patient. It was
Mhm.
very patient focused, but not
Mm,
patient focused towards her as Elaine, that was her name.
Mhm.
Um, it was patient focused towards this woman in bed has this diagnosis and this illness and this potential prognosis. What do we
Mhm.
do with her?
mm.
And that was very obvious to me.
Mhm.
Did you feel like, Waiting Room Revolution, and I know you're familiar, I mean, we're really trying to activate, share information, the questions to ask, and in a way, some of the skills that people didn't know that they needed to have. And it sounds to me like one of the skills that you needed to learn was how to be an advocate in a way. And so, what were you trying to advocate for, and what were you up against? Like, because you're a healthcare provider as a social worker. I mean, and I
Yeah.
know, I suspect you worked with very compassionate colleagues. So I'm not sure it's we needed to teach providers to be more compassionate. It was something missing. So
Yeah.
if you're willing to share a little bit more about what you were trying to advocate for, and you just felt like you were bumping your head against the wall.
Yeah, for absolutely. So I was lucky, well, not lucky, but I was lucky that I had learned over the 16 years how to be a very fierce advocate for my mom. And unfortunately, a lot of caregivers going through situations in our healthcare system that do require a lot of advocacy become extremely good advocates. I think that what we were trying to advocate for was compassion for my mom. And you said healthcare workers are compassionate. And I'm going to talk about, I think, what I think the gap was. And maybe, Sammy, you can maybe add to that too, because I think you have a good perspective of it. But um, it's not that they weren't compassionate, it's that they weren't meeting my mom where she was at or where she would have been given her wishes, given what we knew about her, given who she was as a person. Unfortunately, at this stage in her illness, she couldn't speak. She couldn't advocate for her own self. She couldn't say what she would have wanted. And so, us, as her powers of attorney, were there to say, we know her. This is who she was. And at a certain point, you are actually causing harm to her. And
Mm,
that was a big discrepancy that I think we saw with the team was not really trusting us as her voice, but looking at her and saying, well, this is how she is. And so we just have to deal with what we see in the bed, but we're not looking at the whole person. That was a big issue. So we literally spent a month or more of this. I mean, it was essentially 2 months, but really a month of fighting for who she was and
mm,
fighting for what her wants would have been and fighting to prove that she was declining, to prove that she was dying, and to show that they don't know anything about her and we do. And
Mhm.
it was crazy. Yeah.
Okay, because for the listeners, can you, if you don't mind,
Yeah.
tell us tell us a little bit more about what was happening? Like, tell us about
Yeah.
that last bit where mom began to change and you were thinking,
Sure.
her needs are changing or something's going on.
Yeah. Yeah.
Tell us
So,
about that the last few months.
yeah. So essentially, my mom had declined and she was admitted to hospital, and her vitals were very, very poor. And she had several admissions week after week. And so I called the doctor on the unit at the time and I said, what's going on here? Because my dad is telling me that my mom is not conscious. She's usually conscious. My dad is telling me she hasn't eaten in 4 days. And my dad is now telling me there's some sort of tube, but we don't know what it is. Soon to find out, they had placed an NG tube. My dad had no idea
That's
what
a feeding tube for those people
a
who,
feeding tube.
yeah.
Yes.
Mhm.
That was completely against our what our wishes were and what her wishes would have been. And they had placed a feeding tube at some point between her ER visit and the admission. I can't really figure out why. I think they had probably said to my dad, "How much do you want us to do?" And I think my dad meant do everything you can to kind of save her life, but he didn't mean do a tube. Like there was very much a disconnection and clearly not enough education. And I wasn't involved at this point because he would kind of go through things with her and call me after. So it was a disconnection. Once we found out there was a feeding tube, my father and I got very upset. And my mom also had an encephalocele, which is a hole between the brain and the nose. So there was nothing, no bone there. And it was not safe for her to have a feeding tube because she was very prone to infection in her brain. And she already had a very severe case of dementia. And so when I told the doctor, I don't think she should have a feeding tube, she actually said, "Oh my gosh, no, I have to talk to neurology." And no one knew she had this feeding tube. And so eventually they realized it was very, very risky for her to have this tube. They removed it, but then they said, she's going to pass away. Like she's not going to live. She hasn't eaten in days. And they said, "Do you want to feed her?" And we said, "Listen, if she's going to pass away and she likes eating, part of her disease was always oral fixation. That's a very big component of frontotemporal dementia. Try, if you're telling me she's dying anyway, just try. Like give her whatever she wants." Well, they fed her and then she ate, and then they fed her again and she ate. And she was in this really low state where she was not fully conscious, would be in and out of consciousness, wasn't doing anything, fully bedbound, not engaging whatsoever. But when they would put a fork to her, they would rouse her, put something to her mouth, and she would open her mouth, swallow it, and go back to sleep. And
Mm,
so at that point, they said, "Oh, well, maybe she's not dying as fast as we think she is." And unfortunately, we can't apply to a palliative care unit because we can't prognosticate her. Because with a dementia, they say we don't know how long someone is going to live eating, even minimal amounts of food, right? Because their caloric needs are quite low at that point. So we started entering this really weird place where we didn't know, is she dying? When is she dying? Where is she going? What are we doing? Because now we've thought, oh, she's going to die in 3 days. We've processed that to, oh, we actually don't know. But we can't actually apply to what we thought would be the best place for her. And I've worked with people who've gone to palliative care units. They're like, I love them. Um, so they said we can't apply. So they sent her to a transitional care unit. And then I thought, okay, well, she's at this transitional care unit, but they told us she was going to die 3 days ago, 4 days ago. No one's communicated to us anything. And
mm,
she just continues on like that, but declining, but like very slight declines. It's
mm,
like this and like this. And I think this was at this point, Sammy, where I contacted you and I was like, I don't know what to do because she had been at home for 16 years and her wish
mm,
was not to go to a nursing home. And she was very clear about that. And my dad had promised her that. And now they're telling us she needs to apply to a nursing home. And I said, but you just told me she's dying. So she's not going to a nursing home. And
And the wait for nursing homes, the wait time to get into a nursing home here where we are
yeah,
can be anywhere from 6 months to 2 years.
exactly. Yeah.
So is she dying or is she going to live long enough?
That's exactly it. So now we're panicking because now you're saying, is she's making it to the nursing home? We thought she was dying, and no one is communicating anything with us. They're just saying, we think she might die in this amount of time, but we don't know. She might die in this amount of time. And so at a certain point, my father said, we don't want her to die from aspiration. So how
mhm,
is she going to die here? because I don't understand what's happening. Like, what are you waiting for? Right?
Mm-hmm.
How is this happening? And they essentially said, well, it can go a few ways. She can aspirate because she's going to lose the ability to swallow effectively because of her dementia. She can get an infection when she's lying in bed, or something else can happen. We don't know. We're kind of waiting at this point. And we know it's coming. We just don't know when. And we couldn't understand why, you know, why they were keeping her there, why they were saying nursing home, because again, nursing
Mm-hmm.
home wait times are around 6 months, why she's staying in this place. And they also weren't identifying her pain. And she was someone who could not express pain. She had
Mm-hmm.
been flat, not so no expression for years. She had not verbalized for years. And we knew that she had a shoulder surgery recently for a dislocated and fractured shoulder. And it had been dislocated and fractured for 2 weeks. And she did not express anything. We know that's probably very painful. She had surgery and expressed nothing. So now we were advocating for her to have pain medication because she's lying in bed with all of those things. She still had a sling on. She just had a surgery and she has contractures in her legs. So her legs are all kind of on top of each other, which I would assume is very painful. But getting no pain medication and them telling us she's not in pain. So we are confused. We are trying to grieve because we thought she's dying, but now she's not dying. So they're not giving her pain medication. We can't understand why. And they're feeding her, but they're not honoring anything. And there's no family meetings, right? So you'd think at this point they'd have a meeting with us to talk about her, who she is, what she wanted. No meetings. Um, so anyway, that was the long answer of those were the things that we were very confused about. And I was the one who actually started to say, I need meetings because this is not going in the way that she would have wanted. This is not going in the way that we would have wanted. And I knew too much about the system and I knew too much about applying to nursing homes, right? We've Bill 7.
Mm-hmm.
So you apply to a nursing home, they could put her in any home they wanted for her to wait for the ones that were waiting for her. We're not doing that.
Mhm.
And I'm still thinking she's dying, right? So
Never thought of it, but well, we were in communication back then, which wasn't that long ago, because mom just passed
in March.
5 months ago.
Yeah.
Anyway, that this transition setting that she was in, it was like a metaphor for limbo that you
Limbo.
guys were in. Like you were all in limbo. She was eating, so she's not eligible for a palliative care unit, is what I'm
Correct.
being told. As long
Correct.
as she's eating, she could go on forever. And you were trying to say, well, part of her illness has been that you put anything near this woman's mouth and she opens her mouth and in it
Yeah.
goes.
Yeah.
But in the background of that, she was sleeping more, having very little time awake, not really engaging much anymore. And so the healthcare system could not identify dying.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It put you in a position of not just having to advocate, but I would say you had to fight. Um,
Oh, we were fighting. Yeah, we were
and
fighting.
I remember that, it's hard enough to be grieving the entail of a long illness, but to have to fight, fight, fight the whole time
Hmm.
added to your family's suffering
Yep.
in such a huge way. Like the peaceful kumbaya, being by mom's side, you know, reconciling life and your relationship. Well, there was no time for that. There was no space for
No.
that because you were on guard like the whole time. And
Yep.
I remember, sorry to add salt to the wound, that you started feeling like an unwelcome guest in the
Yep.
care setting. That
Yep.
you would show up, it's like, oh, the daughter's coming, or it's like
Hmm.
that Elaine Seinfeld clip that we show sometimes, like they're writing you up in the chart or something. And
Yep.
there was a sense that you were not working with the healthcare system. You guys were against each other, and your mom was stuck in the middle, but so were you and your dad. It was heart-wrenching, I have to tell you, Stephanie. I had vicarious. anger when you and I would communicate about the whole thing. Um, and finally, what ended up happening?
So finally, which, and this is, I still can't believe this was the events, but finally, because I know players in the system and how things go, I was fortunate enough to have known the ethicist that was around, and I knew the ethics around this because I had worked on cases with it. And so I had actually suggested to the team that they reach out to the ethicist because I said, listen, bring in the ethicist. And if the ethicist is telling us that no, this is not the way we can go, and the ethicist knew the law, she's a lawyer. And so I want to know what's legal here. I want to know what's going on here.
Because just to mention just one,
Yeah.
because what set this up was there came a time where you were wondering whether or not mom should be fed at all.
Yes.
And
Yes,
this
that's
is
right.
the ethical issues came in that the staff at the transition place wanted to keep feeding her because she opened her mouth. But
Yeah.
you and your dad were saying she would eat anything at this point, even not non-food. So that is not, she is dying behind all of this, and you guys are
Yes.
putting her at added risk by
Yes.
using food to a
Right.
person who's dying, and let her be. And so
And
this is
she
what
was suffering. I want to also highlight, we started to notice she was suffering. She couldn't
Mm,
see my kids, who she would love to watch because she was in this facility and I could not bring my children there. She could not, my mom was deaf, fully deaf. So she could not hear. She could not engage in conversation or even listen to conversation while her eyes were closed. Like she was
mm,
stone deaf.
Mhm.
We didn't even know if she could see properly. And we started to argue that she was suffering. And we
mhm,
also were arguing that she was in pain and her pain wasn't being managed in the way that it needed to be. So yes, we started to question a bunch of things, including does she need to be fed, or does she need to be fed the amount that you're giving her, right? Can you feed her less? Like how are you determining this? She was being fed 3 square meals a day, according to I don't know what, and she was being roused
mm,
to eat, and she would fall asleep while she was eating, and they would rouse her back awake. And in the philosophies that I know, we don't do that. So I was very confused. So yes, we brought in an ethicist. The ethicist said, this is legal. This is something that I have dealt with in the past. And then there was a lot of behind the scenes stuff going on between the ethicist and the team that luckily I was not brought into because I don't think I would have been able to handle it, frankly. And the
mm,
decision was made. Oh, yeah.
When you say this is legal, can you?
Oh, it was legal to uphold her wishes and it was legal to honor her, and also that it was legal to note that the way they were feeding her was an artificial way of maintaining her life in the same way that a feeding tube would have been.
mhm,
And they were a because my mom also had cachexia and anorexia, and you can explain what that is. But her body was wasting away. And so she
mhm,
wasn't actually absorbing the food that was being presented to her, and it was artificially maintaining her body for a very short period of time, which was confirmed when she was moved to the palliative care unit, which I'll talk about in a second. But that she was going to die anyway, and it was just a matter of time, and it was really just about where is she dying and what setting is she going to be in. So we had to
mm.
bring someone in to essentially advocate for her, what she would have wanted, what her needs are, and also that we are maintaining her life artificially in this way, and that she's
I
suffering.
would, I would, I would suggest that her life wasn't being maintained with any of that nutrition at that point.
We figured that out later. Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
that she was opening her mouth and it was going in, but in the background, like I said, she was losing weight.
Yeah.
She was more obtunded. She wasn't engaging, and so the nutrition was doing nothing but putting her at risk, actually,
Right.
and
Yeah.
confusing your dad and the staff were
Yeah,
obviously confused.
exactly. The staff were, I don't blame the staff. I think they were actually, the day my mom was transferred there, they said, we don't actually do palliative care here. So we're not really sure what's going on, which also added insult to injury because I panicked. I'm like, what do you mean? Um,
Mhm,
but it was so finally they gave her a prognosis because they said, okay, well, technically, if this isn't prolonging her life, she would live X amount. And she got accepted to a palliative care unit that day, like 2 hours later, which made me so upset because I knew she should have been there a long time before. But anyway, she went and I was relieved, which is crazy because who gets relieved when you get called from a palliative care unit? I was so relieved. I cried when she was accepted because we fought. It was a fight. And she was also accepted to a palliative care unit where my daughter goes to the daycare there. So I was actually
Mm.
able to spend more time with my child. I hadn't seen or spent time with my children in a month. My whole life was dedicated to my mom and advocating for her dignity at the end of her life, which like my kids would comment on it all the time. All you care about is mommy. You don't care about us anymore.
Mm.
Um, and so, yeah, she went there. And the second she got there, they looked at me and said, "This woman is in so much pain." And I was validated, but I was so angry. And I said, "How do you know she's in pain?" And they had their ways of seeing it. And they put her on a CAD pump, which is a continuous infusion of medication because she was in so much pain. And they also told me that even if they continued to feed her, she would live for 2 weeks and that it wouldn't do anything for her, which is exactly what you were saying, Sammy. And so ultimately, she would have died in the transitional care unit had we
Mhm.
not fought. And we had the most beautiful experience at this palliative care unit. I'm so thankful that we got her there. She got to spend time with my kids with meaningful, engaging experiences. They did art with her as much as she was able to, I mean, not really participate, but we made beautiful art with her. They treated her so well. She was so dignified. Like it was amazing. I sat with her all day. My dad sat with her all day, and we were able to finally grieve. Like we had that relief.
Mm.
And my mom smiled for the first time in years. Smiled.
Wow.
And so we knew that this was the right thing, and we actually didn't fully stop feeding her, which is the crazy part of it all, is because that was the thing that we didn't. They said, well, we can continue. And we were like, you know what? It's fine. It's fine because you're validating us and you are ending her suffering by having her here. And she did, she passed a week later.
Stephanie, I mean, thank you so much for opening your heart and sharing what is really a trauma, a really
Yeah.
traumatic experience of, and I'm listening, thinking, you know, really, we're trying to activate patients and families, and knowing that you have to be an advocate, but
Yeah.
you had to be, you had to. Sometimes that means you had to fight. And feel like adversarial, and it's crazy to me because um, the healthcare providers didn't want to do the wrong thing. They were trying to follow the
No.
rules, but they didn't have the training to recognize, and it just didn't make sense. So it's wild, but it was needed. And maybe now's a good time to pivot because that is really the backdrop and the fuel
Hmm.
for your work and your passion, which is the compassion and caregiving, the company and the Caregivers Compass podcast. So maybe we can talk a little bit about that. I mean, what are the skills that you try to teach and talk about that you feel, are missing and that you think are the sort of the most important things that, caregivers listening and patients listening, they need to know. Um,
Yeah. I think it is important. Oh, yeah. Sorry. Go on.
I want to just stress that in this situation, it wasn't that Stephanie was missing any skills. She had beyond skills. Yeah. And I
it
know
was
you
the healthcare providers. No, I meant the healthcare providers didn't have the skills to recognize.
couldn't recognize when someone's dying. If your mom had had cancer, this would have been a completely different.
100%. And they said that over and over again, by the way.
Ugh.
Well,
Yeah.
many people who have non-cancer diagnoses that are still progressive and end up being life-limiting, they have a harder time um, because people really don't talk about or understand, because it's not taught formally to healthcare providers, what ordinary dying looks like with those particular illnesses.
Yes.
So you get stuck in the vortex of no one really understanding what stage we're at.
Yeah.
So the gap really is in the training of healthcare providers and also really societal's mortality awareness and our natural education we should be getting in our entire lives about what the end of life looks like. But as long as we are a death denying society and a death denying healthcare system, and our curriculum in healthcare is um, void of these skills, then even if we have amazingly activated, empowered patients and caregivers, we're still we're still in a little bit of a crisis.
Yeah.
Okay, having said that, hopefully your example is an extreme version of what typically will happen, and that with some of the skills that you embody, Stephanie, that people will get what they need. So back to Cian's question about what is it that you would, uh, what tips, suggestions would you want our listeners to know about being in the best position possible as a patient or caregiver?
Yeah, and I will say that I hope my experience was extreme. I think honestly it was made more extreme by the fact that I know so much about the system. And I think had I not been there, yeah,
So true.
I think honestly things would have been very different. Like I wouldn't have fought so much and therefore wouldn't have been under so much stress had I not known the system as well,
Well,
right?
not only that, what would have happened if you were not in the equation or you were just quietly passive
Yes.
and showed up with a smile?
Yeah.
Is that your mom still would have died. She would have died
Yes.
in the transitional unit, and you would have thought, oh, mom's died suddenly today, I guess, because no
Yes.
one, like you wouldn't have pushed the envelope about
Exactly.
anything. You wouldn't have questioned the feeding. You wouldn't have been, you just would have sat there wondering what's going on with mom.
Yes, exactly. Yes. So, what I will say here is what I did find interesting, which very much relates to this, is I noticed when our clients were coming to us, our caregiver clients, that 54%, just over, were noting to us that they were actually having concerns that they were seeing us for related to navigating the system and
Mm.
not because of their direct caregiving. And to me, that was quite substantial. I actually started to do some research of the literature about it because, although not surprising to me, it was interesting that it was showing up that way in my practice. And so I think what I see with the clients I work with and skills that I think will be helpful for others is really trusting our gut. I think that, and I saw this with my dad a lot. He is a baby boomer who very much trusts, this is the doctor's right. I might know what I want, but it doesn't matter. He said that all the time.
Mhm.
We need to trust our gut, and we also need to remember who the person is that is beside us.
Mhm.
We know them best. We know who they are and who they were. We know what their likes and dislikes were. We know what they looked like and what they look like now. Because again, my mom lost probably over 100 pounds in the span of a few months. Okay. We know that. They don't know that. They're seeing us in a snapshot of time. And I'm a healthcare worker. Okay. So I also can appreciate, I don't bash healthcare workers. I love healthcare workers. But there is a lot of discrepancy, and we have to be the one to say, no, this isn't right. Let me show you why. Let me show you the pictures. Let me show you what I know to be true. And if something feels wrong, voice it. It may not align with how our system works. It may not be the way that it can go, but at least there's an opportunity to explore it.
Mhm.
Because if we don't voice something and we stay silent, we don't know if there are other options.
Mhm.
Hmm.
And that is really important. I work with a lot of people who think that there's no other option, and there are other options. We just have to explore avenues. The other thing I want to say is, despite you feeling like the system is working against you, the truth is that healthcare workers actually do want to collaborate. They do want to work together with you because they do care. They just, as you said, Sammy, are maybe lacking some of the training involved with different elements of this. There is also a substantial pressure in the system. There are guidelines that have to be dealt with. They need discharge plans. I knew all of that very well because they have to show the people above. That's how the ministry works. That's how funding works. But the actual workers really do want to work with you. And so try to be with them, to work as a team, because the family and the patient is actually very much part of the interprofessional team. That's something that's also missing, and maybe sometimes there's a divide and a hierarchy. They need to work with you together to focus on your family. And so I think when you have those two things in mind, not looking at it as the enemy and not looking at they know everything and I don't, you're going to be a lot better off to start having those discussions and see what else is possible, again, within the confines of the system.
I love that.
I always
Listening to your gut and knowing they want to collaborate is like, so key. I was just gonna say that in just those few minutes, Stephanie, you touched on all the seven keys, really.
Oh, really?
Kind of. I mean, inviting yourself, which is really the bravery to speak up. But we say there clinicians want, many of them, most of them want to are grateful that you bring it up.
Yeah.
And they want to collaborate. And you talked about connect the dots, which people often think it's just about an electronic medical record, but you so nicely explained how it's really about bringing who that person is and connecting to all the different providers because they don't know. And you have that role to not just ask questions, but to share information that you see and also to bring that person's voice forward and customizing your order. There are guidelines, but there are ways to make it person centered and person and family centered. So it's and how important the family's role is. So you touched on so many pieces of the skills that we sort of uncovered.
and zoom out how important it was to step back and say, where are we at here? Like, let's look at where things have changed and what should we be expecting at this stage of the illness. And also walking two roads, like hoping that, you know, mom was going to have the dying and death experience that you thought she wanted, and but planning for like, oh, what setting are we going to be in? And
Yeah.
just in case it ends up here or there or everywhere, let's think of all options here. Yeah, so you really did embody all of the seven keys that we suggest are the difference between being an in the dark caregiver versus an in the know caregiver. Um, but like I said, your story highlights that you can be as activated as you as you can be, and you were, but if the system doesn't begin to learn how to identify the changing needs of patients, especially in the more advanced and end stage of life, then there can be this conflict that's set up between them and us, kind of thing. So
Yeah.
I loved what you said also about how we underutilize family, and we saw that in COVID, right? We saw when families weren't allowed into facilities that people died. Their
Yeah.
loved ones died, and it wasn't because
Yeah.
they got the wrong medicine or anything. It's because the families were instrumental in the care,
Yeah.
and um, and families are responsible for personalizing the patient, making sure that the person is never washed out of the patient. And
Yeah.
so, like, please put this gown on my mom. She loves red. Let's put these pictures by her bed because these are her important people. Or please
Mhm.
don't position her like that. She never liked that. And did you know that my mom was a school principal? Whatever it was or is, it's the family's responsibility to not just be involved in instrumental things like driving them to appointments and taking care of them when they're not in the hospital, but they play a huge role in making sure that that patient is seen as a person, a unique person. I think
Yeah.
you did that so well, so well. Like, I guess what I want to know is how you're doing
Hmm.
the months after such a traumatic ending in many ways.
Well, initially it was very confusing because, again, it was a 16-year long illness. So that became a normal part of my life. It was the norm for my mom to be ill. And the last few months were horrible, but the last week was beautiful. And so we were able to have this really beautiful moment at the end that I think made all of that time not okay, but better. And we focus on the last week. That's what we do. Frankly, I'm okay. Because my mom had really been a complete shell of herself for a very long time. And seeing how she was at the end and knowing that she was suffering, we really do kind of lean on she's free now.
Mm,
We felt like at the end she was very much not free, and all she wanted to do was be free. And
mm,
so that brings us tremendous comfort. It also makes me feel okay because my dad is finally seeing life for the first time in 16 years.
yeah.
He is speaking to friends again. He is exploring what it is to live because caregiving took away everything from him. And we are learning a new path. I mean, of course, I'm sad that I lost my mom. It's very final now. Whereas before I would go visit her and be with her and take my kids with her. So that part is very sad, but I am okay. Yeah.
Mhm, mhm. And that's a testimony to the fact that this was a long illness. Your mom
Yeah.
declining, you saw it in front of you for years. Every year she was different. And so this idea of anticipating a loss and preparing yourself makes you surprisingly able to pick up and move on, as you know better
Yeah.
than I do, after even such a traumatic final couple of months. So your dad is getting back to learning how to live again.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Weirdly.
So it's bittersweet. Yeah. Yeah, but lovely, right? In a way.
Yeah,
Mm.
I think it's confusing for him because obviously he misses her, but he doesn't miss the person that she was, right? And
Yeah.
he's processing all of that time. And I think just he's reconnecting with my kids. Like he barely was able to engage with my children. And so
Hmm.
I think for him, this is a new world. He has a lot of time now and he can, think a lot and do a lot. But yeah, he has his life back. And not to say that he, didn't he loved my mom so dearly, but it really, really zapped him. I
Hmm.
mean, we didn't have a connection. And now we are starting to form a connection again. So, and
Hmm.
he's not a young man. So the fact that someone of that age can start to see life again is quite remarkable for me to see.
Mhm.
Were there one of the things that we sometimes get asked about is, how, especially for long-term caregivers, how they sort of are respite or how they're able to do self-care. I don't really love
Mhm.
those words,
Yeah.
but were there strategies you used to try to stay grounded or um, stay grounded, maybe is the right way to say it. Were there things that you did to sort of refill your tank, small sips of respite?
Yeah, I think I'll refer to those last few months because those were very intense. Yes, I did. I would ensure to have regular exercise during the week. So there's a place that I like to go to exercise, and it's kind of an escape place for me. So 4 times a week I would go there. That was a non-negotiable for me. I didn't care what
Good
was
for you.
going on. I was very, very lucky. My husband is incredible, and he very much took an active role with my kids. And I know that's not always possible, but I had him. So I would be very able to be open to him and say, you know what, I'm tapped out. I can't. I need to leave. Um, I took a lot of space, a lot of space. My nervous system was really shot, and so when I usually have, so much capacity for something, I had very little capacity because all of my capacity was taken. So
Hmm.
just being able to acknowledge and identify where in my body I was at and what I could handle and what I couldn't really got me through because I didn't want to snap on other people around me because it wasn't about them, right? It was
Mm.
about my mom. It was not about them at all. So those things kept me through. And then just, every single day, just saying, like, we are going to get somewhere. We're going to be okay. Frankly, having people to speak to was really important. Like, I'm so grateful for you, Sammy, and other people that I was just able to talk to who could validate me at a time when I felt very invalidated. So just having someone to validate you. And Frankly, that could even come in the form of a therapist or a clinician if you don't have anybody else. Having a safe space to be validated is really essential to get through because that's half the battle.
Mhm. I like what you said about I had like my own personal mantra. I was
Yeah.
going to get somewhere today. That's something that I think maybe people could try. That's not too onerous, like having to join a gym or whatever, but
Yeah.
even just telling yourself something that can keep you going a bit is a little sip, just a tiny.
Yes, that's right. And if we didn't get somewhere that day that was tangible, it would be, well, I'm going to get there tomorrow. I think we never gave up. We knew that we were going to get somewhere. Well, my dad kind of was like, no, it's not going to work. And then I said, yes, it will work.
Mhm.
And so I think just believing that at the end of the day, something will work,
Mhm.
um, was also what got me through.
Mhm.
I'm not sure we ended up letting you answer the question of what tips you would have
Oh,
for other
I,
Like
characters.
what are yeah, what are some of the skills that you teach the clients that you work
oh,
with? Yeah,
yeah. So,
to
so
help
what I
navigate
said
them.
before, I think some of those things that I said that I embodied about, honoring what you know, all
Oh,
of the,
yes. Sorry,
yes,
you
I
say
did
that.
say that.
Sorry.
I'll also, just highlight that when I work with a lot of caregivers, we are focusing on underlying emotions too. So, what
Mhm.
is coming up for them behind the scenes? Where do we think that's coming from? How can we identify where those things are hitting us in our body? How can we kind of regulate our nervous system? Approaches to getting through are also really important. And a lot of the emotions that come up in the moment, and people are very shocked by this, sometimes have nothing to do with the actual caregiving, but long before, and things are being triggered by the moment. So just staying
Mhm.
aware of that, and we go through that too. So there are a lot of ranges of things that we might deal with, but in terms of the actual navigation, it was the stuff that I talked about before.
That's really helpful. Well, I
It's
can
it's
imagine if I had someone like you in my life, well, for when I am going through this mysterious role of caregiving, I would be in good hands for sure. That's no
Yeah,
doubt.
yeah, I mean, we were talking with, we've had death doulas on our show, and I think maybe if people wrap their heads around what that is, they may start thinking it's only for the patient. But I think what you're saying is many of these skills that you have lived and are coaching and educating others in are and 100% applicable to the families. In fact, maybe even more so in many cases, um, because it's all the same kind of skills dealing with grief and emotions and all of that. It's not just the patients going through. It's the whole team. So I think that's incredible. How has been leading the podcast? Your podcast. So,
Oh, the
so for
podcast is
listeners,
great.
caregivers, Compass is a
Yeah.
podcast that people can check out, and you can hear more of Stephanie and all the wisdom that she has.
Yeah, the podcast is great. We're on season 5. And I talk about my experiences. I talk about my experiences as a mental health clinician with caregivers and also an inpatient social worker. And we have incredible guests on from all walks of life, caregivers, but also professionals, including Sammy was on the last episode of last season. And yeah, so I think at this point, there's probably something everyone can relate to, and it's available on all platforms.
Amazing. They should check that out. It has been so much fun talking with you, Stephanie. I mean, fun maybe is not the word, but informative. I've learned a lot. I really appreciated how clear and articulate you were on talking about something so personal. Was there a question or something that we didn't ask you or something that you wanted to talk about to share with our listeners about your work and about
Um,
your vision?
I think just, as a whole, to maybe this isn't necessarily for the caregiver specifically who's navigating, but I think the overarching system is just that I think we need to do a better job of teaching what the caregiver is. And I think caregiver is a newer word that we're starting to hear. It wasn't there at all when I first started caring. But we have to understand how integral and important the caregiver is. We have to understand what the caregiver is going through. And we have to understand that without the caregiver, the patient would suffer. And it is very much a team between both and the healthcare system. So my vision would be to see that type of education in schools, to see that type of education being incorporated right when healthcare practitioners start in their role. There are some amazing trainings like through caregiver-centered care in Alberta. But we have to, I think, do better at just providing more awareness. That's the part that's lacking at this point.
Yeah.
That
That was well said. Are you familiar with some of our workbook and our workshop
Yep.
in a box? Because I
Yep.
we are thinking of, it was really designed for the public, but I do think healthcare organizations could get on board, or people, these kinds of courses could exist or be peer led to really gently introduce people to the role, the responsibilities, and the value and power that they actually have and need to assert, really, if they want to have the kind of care experience that, they've envisioned or deserve, really, without it getting too far, before it starts getting very complicated, or
Yeah.
all the system navigation stuff. But really, just from the start, you're entering into this new role. So it sounds like, you're already an ambassador, but if we'll connect more and share with you some of our train the trainers. But it might be something that could fit as a tool in your toolbox, or
Yeah.
maybe that other people, in your circles could support, because everything you're offering is exactly what people need. I bet you they didn't even know they were a caregiver, or that these kinds of education and supports were available. So that's what it's incredible that we get to share what you're doing with our audience, but also to keep to learn from people like you who are doing amazing things. So
Well,
thank you.
thank you. Thank you for giving me the platform. I've not shared that publicly yet, so I appreciate this being the place to do
Thanks for
so.
listening. Our workbook, Applying the 7 Keys for Navigating a Life-Changing Diagnosis, is available now at all online bookstores. Visit our website for more details and to access our free resources, event listings, and learn all about our movement. The best way to keep up with us and our work is to join our newsletter list, or better yet, become an ambassador. This episode was produced by Maggie Sivak, myself, Kayla McMillan, Shilpa Jyothi Kumar, Bethany Bachanfuso, and Kathleen Bartlett. Our theme music is Maypole by Ketsa.